Hi, my name is Davis. I'm the current president of the Linux Users Group at NC State and also a very big Vim fan, and today I'm going to be talking about how you can learn Vim and how I recommend learning Vim. So first I'll start with a quick overview of the presentation itself. I'll start by talking about how to learn and some of the recommendations and things you should keep in mind while you're learning. And then I'll talk about ways you can learn and practice. Then I'll talk about some files you can reference while you're learning that will help be a good, they're a good supplemental resource you can use. Next, I'll talk about additional resources you can use if maybe the tools that I've presented so far haven't helped. You can look at these tools instead. And then I'll talk about things you can learn once you've mastered the basics of Vim and you want to go further. So whenever people are learning Vim, I like to show this classic picture that you might have seen before. And it's a classical learning curve for some of the common text editors. And so for Notepad, you can see it's very simple. You learn a few basic things, and that's it. For Visual Studio, I guess what they're showing here is that it starts off hard. You have to learn the interface and everything. But then, the Visual Studio itself will do things for you, I guess is what they're saying. But for VI, which is actually, VI is related to Vim. It's like simpler Vim. So for VI, it starts off very hard, but then it doesn't get any harder, which is kind of nice. But what this is saying is that it's just totally different than anything you've ever used before, and so you have to spend a lot of time just getting used to what it is and how to use it. But once you know that, you know all you need to know, basically. And so it's really important to keep in mind that you will be slower at first compared to where you were before, just because it's so different from anything else. But once you learn it, you'll be, within a week or so probably, you'll be about as efficient as you used to be. And then the more time you spend on it, the more efficient you'll become until eventually you can be way faster with Vim than you were before. I recommend learning with an interactive tutorial that I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then I also recommend using the user manual and help files, which I'll also talk about later. The most important thing to remember when you're learning and practicing Vim is that Vim is modal. It's a very common thing that trips people up all the time, so it's very important to keep in mind. And it's kind of confusing, but basically the way to think about it is there are different modes that Vim can be in when you're using it. So when you're in normal mode, you're just moving around basically. And when you're in insert mode, you can type and add text like you would in any regular text editor basically. So this is something that's really important to keep in mind that trips up a lot of newer people. I also recommend, as you're learning, to only introduce one or two new things at a time. This can keep you from becoming overwhelmed and mixing up things, and also it just reduces your frustration. I recommend learning with an interactive tool called Vim Tutor. And so what I recommend is you use Vim Tutor, and you can read the whole thing or just a few pieces at a time, whatever you want. But as you read, pick up one or two things that you want to add to your current workflow, and just really nail them down for a day or two until you're very comfortable with them. And then go back to Vim Tutor and look at something else to add. So when you're using Vim Tutor, ideally it should just work. You should just be able to type on your console or command line Vim Tutor and then hit enter, and it will come up with a screen that looks like this. If it doesn't though, you can launch Vim and then make sure you're in normal mode by hitting escape and then type :help Vim Tutor, and it will come up with a page that looks like this. And so if you're at this stage, you can use J to scroll down, and it just talks about what Vim Tutor is. And so, for instance, it has some helpful info, like if you want Vim to be launched in a different language, FR for French, for instance. But the most important part here, for now, is that if Vim Tutor wasn't installed properly, you can launch it using this command here. And so that's another way to use it if it wasn't installed properly. But either way, once you've got Vim Tutor up and running, you can see it's just kind of like a narrative walkthrough that you follow along with and edit as you read. And so it talks about moving the cursor and exiting Vim and adding text and stuff. It's a very thorough and quick guide. It says that it takes about 30 minutes, which is pretty true in my experience. So, I just recommend reading through this quickly to get you up and running and learning Vim pretty well. Next, I recommend the user manual and help files. The user manual is a more book-like tutorial, but it also goes much more in-depth than Vim Tutor. And so to get it, you use help USR TOC, excuse me. So you just go help USR TOC, and it comes up with this, the Vim user manual, table of contents. And so you can see all these, they're broken into different sections. There's a getting started section, there's an editing effectively section, tuning Vim, making it work for you, and so on. And so there are all these guides that you can use that talk about Vim in an easy to understand way. And so the way you get to these is, say you want to learn, I don't know, moving around. Help USR 03, and it'll bring you there. You can also, of course, use more efficient ways to move around if you'd like. So if you're on the colored part right here, you can do Control right bracket, and it will bring you to that page. And this is true for any text that's formatted, like this. And so that's an easy way to jump around with the throughout the manual. And you can use Control O to go backwards. These don't really make a lot of sense, so you don't have to use them, but they're just something that are helpful if you're frustrated trying to remember, which one you were at before or whatever. Something to keep in mind. There are also the help files themselves. I've talked about help a lot already, but basically it's technical coverage, and it's the most detailed documentation, but I think it's a little bit terse and confusing if you're a new user. But there's a lot of good information about virtually everything in Vim if you know how to find what you're looking for. And so, for instance, say I want to know more about J. I just type help J, and it will tell me, you go count lines downward line-wise. Okay, well, what does line-wise mean? And so you can do help line-wise. Whenever it's in blue like that, that means it's something that's in the help files. And they're just, a little bit confusing and maybe a little technical, but once you know what you're using, these are very useful to read to kind of understand Vim a little bit better. So there are also some additional resources if what you've done so far just isn't really clicking, or maybe you want a more fun way to practice. And the first one is Vim Snake. It teaches you extremely basic movement and also modes. And so as you can see, I'm at Vim Snake, and it just has some basic instructions. You use HJK and L to move the snake around. And you can only eat the food when you're in insert mode. And then you have to use escape to exit insert mode. And so it just kind of teaches you to think about the different modes and think about basic navigation and how you can't navigate while you're in insert mode. You can only type, or I guess eat in this case. So it's a kind of simple but fun little guide that I found to be useful in getting used to moving around in Vim. Another recommendation I have is Vim Adventures. It's a more game-like tutorial that helps you learn basic movement, a little more in-depth and more movement than Vim Snake. But unfortunately, it's paid after the first few levels, so it's a good tool to use. I haven't ever paid for it personally, so I can't recommend it. But the free version I definitely think is very good. And it's just like Vim Snake, you move around with HJKLNL, and it's kind of a game, and they teach you different things and whatnot. And it's pretty interactive and good, and it teaches you a few concepts that are important. So I'd recommend at least the free version, if nothing else. There's also the On-Ramp to Vim video series, which are well-done videos that cover basic and some advanced techniques as well. And if you learn in videos better, this is essentially doing what Vim Tutor is and then a little bit more, but in a video format. So if you want to get through this in a more, in a video series basically, this is what I'd recommend doing instead. Finally, there's Vim Golf, which is a kind of fun way to compete with your friends if you have multiple people who are learning at once, or just with yourself. And what you do is you try and find the most efficient way to change some text as possible. And the setup is pretty simple. If you have Ruby, it's just gem install Vim Golf setup, and then Vim Golf put whatever the challenge ID is. And so there are different challenges they have. And so I've already picked one here. Rural post is what they call it. And so if you wanted to do this, you just type Vim Golf put, and then, whatever the ID is. And so here, it's downloading the challenge, because I've already set it up. And you want to go from this text here, and you want to get it to here in as few strokes as possible. So, it's kind of fun to think about different ways you can do this, and, maybe you're going to do this, and then, whatever. There's a bunch of different ways you can look at it. And if you're done, I didn't do it right, obviously, but it counts how many strokes you took. And it says I wasn't right, and so you can quit, retry, show the difference, whatever. And so that's just a fun way to kind of think about more efficient ways to edit text and, compete with your friends and try and come up with the best way if you can. But there's a lot more to Vim than just the basic movement. And actually, even with the basic movement alone, you can already be pretty efficient. But with these tools, you can become even more efficient than you were before. There are plugins, macros, autocomplete, and windows and tabs. And I won't talk about them here because it's beyond the scope of this presentation. But there are some tutorials that I have that are pretty good about talking about these things. And one of them is actually the Linux Users Group presentations page, which I'll have a link at the end. But if you just search for Vim, you can see that we have a few presentations we've given before on Vim, and they talk about some of these things in some depth. So I'd recommend that. There's also a series of videos called Semicolon and Sons, which they're partially paid. Every other video is paid. But the free videos are very good. I've never used or looked at the paid versions, so I can't recommend them. But the free ones are very well done and pretty thorough, so I'd recommend those as well. Finally, there's a playlist called Thoughtbot, or from Thoughtbot, called Vim Meetups. And there are a bunch of interesting presentations about Vim. I've watched most of them before, and I'd recommend them. They're pretty good, if nothing else, to learn about different ways you can use Vim. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can email oit_hbc@help.ncsu.edu, or you can use the Linux Users Group forum.lug.ncsu.edu, and you can just you can post a thread, choose the title, put in the verification, and ask a question, and we'll be more than happy to help. We also have an IRC if you are familiar with IRC and want to join there. It's not super active, but you can probably join in and ask a question, and we'll try and respond within a day or so. So yeah, so that about does it for me. Here are the references. You can see these are some of the links that I talked about earlier, if you'd like to look at any of those in a little bit more depth. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.